Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the new movie diary in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. It's been a little while since I got back in the saddle, had a little hiccup last week that prevented me from making a new episode, but now that we're here, and before we get into the double feature I'll be reviewing for this episode, I'd like to just do a quick little roundup of assorted films I've seen during my hiatus. First up, Bad Things, written and directed by Stuart Thorndike, her second feature film following her 2014 debut, Lyle. This is an independent horror film starring Gail Rankin, Hari Neff, Annabelle Dexter-Jones, and Rod Pereira, and it basically functions fairly explicitly as a meta-modern, queer, feminist twist on Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, with a little bit of Robert Altman's Three Women thrown in there. The opening credit font is even the same as Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and I actually saw this all the way back at the end of August, only 2 days after it was released by Shudder, and I guess I just didn't end up including it in my episode for that following week on Gran Turismo and Retribution, because despite some nice touches here and there, I just didn't really find it terribly evocative or engaging. It really is surprising how, just functionally speaking, Thorndike's vision of a queer feminist twist on The Shining isn't really much more than a retread of The Shining, although I will say that I think one of the more interesting things about Bad Things is how it becomes a kind of intertextual dialogue with not so much Kubrick's film as the sort of behind-the-scenes drama and contemporary controversy around it. I'm thinking specifically about Kubrick's, some would say, abusive treatment of the actress Shelley Duvall, and how much Duvall's constantly sort of traumatized performance is so central to what makes The Shining still so harrowing and disturbing as a film. Just Duvall's visage in The Shining is almost like the cinematic version of Edvard Munch's The Scream. Her face and her mounting hysterical terror is so iconic, and once you know more about Kubrick and Duvall's very tense relationship during the filming of The Shining, and really when you see some behind-the-scenes footage where Kubrick really does come off as a very dismissive and abusively perfectionist director who at once is so demanding but also doesn't really know what he wants and sort of seems to lump passive-aggressive abuse on Duvall for it more so than the male actors. I can't help but think that that sort of metatextual reputation of The Shining isn't part of Thorndike's attempt here to kind of imagine a new, unofficial adaptation of The Shining that not only centers women but also queer people, and also where you find it's basically boiling down to a kind of opaque emotional endurance test in which all of the central characters are gradually reduced to this hysterical nightmare. And I can't help but feeling that it's a situation where the shadow of Duvall's iconic performance is kind of being channeled here in a almost occult kind of way. And it took months for Jack Torrance's Mask of Sanity to completely slip in The Shining. In Bad Things, it's only a couple of days before this gaggle of hipsters, all of whom are very pathetic and self-involved in their own unique ways, before they all basically descend into madness. Even still, I honestly found Bad Things only to be kind of nominally interesting rather than particularly disturbing or compelling as a story, and when you're going to court a film like The Shining as a point of reference, you're also kind of exposing your own film to the most obvious point of comparison and contrast, which is just the sense of atmosphere to it. The Shining is one of the most atmospheric horror films ever made. It's practically all an exercise in atmosphere rather than character or story, and so in addition to none of the principal characters being terribly interesting, there's just no resonant atmosphere to Bad Things. At least I feel. I'm comfortable giving this one a fair 2 out of 5. Also, from the end of August, I saw 2 Gravitas Ventures releases, Slotherhouse and Bootyology, and for those of you who do not know, Gravitas Ventures is an indie distributor that is pretty much synonymous with a big chunk of really low-budget and regional independent features and documentaries that at any one point makes up a good chunk of the product that gets warehoused both on major streaming platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime, as well as smaller ads-based streamers like Tubi especially. especially. I've personally become very familiar with Gravitas Ventures just because I'm very interested and fascinated by films that are not made only outside of the major commercial film industry, but pretty much as far to the fringes of commercial filmmaking as possible, that you're not even guaranteed that what you're watching is going to be a bare minimum threshold of production quality or at least professional experience behind the camera, that what you're seeing even necessarily qualifies, for lack of a better way of putting it, as a real movie. And on the one hand, there's a morbid curiosity that's a part of my interest in this growing phenomenon of streaming and video on demand, giving an expanded distribution and revenue model for an explosion in low budget and regional filmmaking that just a couple decades ago would only have been visible in terms of the physical direct-to-video market, like the types of movies that you only find at the very bottom of a bargain bin at a major box store, or even on those like Lazy Susans in a rest stop gas station. Streaming and video on demand has made these sorts of movies so much more visible than ever before, and frankly, you could argue that they're also becoming so much more viable a market of the mainstream commercial film industry, precisely because major studios and distributors are significantly disincentivized in recent decades from producing mid to low budget movies, or even from picking them up for distribution. Part of my fascination with this stuff is just morbid curiosity, but another part of it is just the hope that, maybe I will stumble upon something really fun or unique. And while I won't say that either Slotherhouse or Bootyology are good movies precisely, at the very least in the case of Slotherhouse, which is really a rather straightforward horror comedy basically about an evil sloth that runs riot in a college sorority, in the case of this film, I think I can at least safely say that it's one of the best looking, most consummately produced movies I've ever seen released under the Gravitas Ventures banner. And Gravitas must have thought about as much, because as opposed to Bootyology, I actually did get to see Slotherhouse on the big screen. Gravitas actually gave this movie a pretty significant theatrical push. It came out on August 30th, and up until a couple of days ago, I was still seeing showtimes for it at some local Regal cinemas. So I can only suspect that in this case, Gravitas thought they really had the potential for a kind of word-of-mouth horror comedy hit. And I will say that Slotherhouse is about as good as a Gravitas Ventures pickup can usually get without necessarily being a solidly good movie. It was certainly a pleasure to see a production like this on the big screen, but as both a horror film and a comedy, this isn't really a terribly successful venture. The best things I can say about it really is just the sort of charming aspect that the rare low-budget production of this type has, where even when the production quality is actually relatively solid and even exceptionally executed at times, you never really leave a mindset of feeling like you're supporting this film more than you're really enjoying it. And yet at the same time, you find yourself kind of in on that charming exercise of community, of spectators and artists just going for broke and trying their best at executing a very high concept, strange idea outside of the major system. There were no doubt parts of Slotherhouse where I found myself very caught off guard by how good everything looked in terms of costume and production design and cinematography. And the killer sloth itself, I don't necessarily think there's enough character to the monster here, but there is just kind of an elemental appeal of seeing the sloth they've created for this film, which is never quite convincing, but definitely looks appealing in action, and that's really where the film works most as a comedy, is just sort of that, again, kind of elemental charm of watching this low-budget sloth monster doing its thing. But besides that, there is definitely an impressive aspect to the production of Slotherhouse, to an extent that it even puts to shame a lot of contemporary indie horror pickups that bigger distributors like Netflix or Amazon usually snatch up before companies like Gravitas can get to them. I can't really call Slotherhouse good, but I can definitely call it charming, which is why I'm comfortable giving it a well-earned 2.5 out of 5. But on the other end of the spectrum, I'm afraid I don't have anything terribly positive to say about Bootyology, which is more typical of the direct-to-streaming video video-on-demand content that is Gravitas's bread and butter. This is a mockumentary directed by this guy named Joe Eddy and co-written by Eddy, with the stars of the film Chris Lightbody and Spencer Yaris. Lightbody and Yaris portray a pair of rappers who all of their songs are about butts, and there's this really strange chain of events leading from a music label using an AI algorithm to recommend them artists to cultivate, to them uncovering this obscure rap group, to finding out that this rap group has been basically frozen Encino Man style in a freezer in the back of a bar, and then them getting thawed out and being given a contract to write a new album. It's kind of a perfect manifestation of the kind of comedic premise that takes way too long to explain. And unfortunately, while there are some nice touches to Bootyology, especially in terms of the faux archival moments showing these fictional rappers that Lightbody and Yaris portray in their early days, the real cardinal sin that this movie commits is being a comedy that isn't funny. It really is unfortunate because there's such a simple and interesting idea here about a mockumentary about two old white rappers who, because of the modern day algorithm, are suddenly being told they have an opportunity to record new material, but being completely out of the loop of contemporary rap. But Eddy and his team of filmmakers just show like no interest in just building off that idea. This movie just kind of keeps going in all of these different directions, very few of which are funny or humorously executed, some of which basically don't even make sense within just the basic context and scenarios that the filmmakers have given themselves. The characters aren't very consistent. Nobody here seemed to be able to commit to a bit, and as someone who considers themselves at least somewhat fond of hip-hop, I'll even admit to being kind of galled by how little interest these filmmakers seem to be having in making a mockumentary about hip-hop, how little interest they seem to actually have in making a comedy about hip-hop and music and how the scene changes, because that's the thing. I can be remarkably charitable if it comes to a film produced by people who try really hard but just don't have the resources or even the talent to achieve what they set out to. But with Bootyology, you can't even say anybody really tried, and everything they tried to do was basically worthless. This is far worse than simply a compromised movie or a product of lack of talent. This is a lazy movie, and definitely one of the worst movies I've seen all year. If you're like me and you like pursuing these sorts of fringe movies out of morbid curiosity or in the hunt for a hidden gem this is not. Don't waste your time. I've wasted mine for you. This is an easy 1.5 out of 5, just an awful movie. But in between Slaughterhouse and Bootyology, I did a proper theatrical double feature of 2 real movies that same weekend at the end of August. And not only that, I did a very nice queer double feature by driving out to Philly and curating my own double feature. First of MUTT, the debut feature by writer-director Vuk Lungalov-Klotz, and then Bottoms, the highly anticipated lesbian high school comedy directed by Emma Seligman and co-written by Seligman and star Rachel Sennett. In the first case, MUTT is the sort of textbook day-long urban drama set in New York starring Leo Mejil as a transgender man who basically over the course of a single hectic 24 hours has these episodic encounters with various people from whom he's been estranged since transitioning, first his ex-boyfriend, then his little sister, and then his father who is visiting from Chile. Having enjoyed several of Lungalov-Klotz's shorts leading up to this, I will say that I don't necessarily think MUTT is an amazing debut, despite its subject matter and some decent tension to the drama. This is a surprisingly wistful story. One of these dramas that I think one of the best things about it actually is that it doesn't really attempt to tell a whole story out of any one of its 3 episodes, but just kind of interweaves these encounters and then almost rather abruptly ends the film on a note where you feel like the story has kind of just gotten started as opposed to ending. And I think structurally and tonally, MUTT is actually actually quite a nice film. It's just that, and while I certainly don't begrudge Lungalov Klotz as a trans filmmaker in this way, it does feel like a lot of the dialogue, the sort of episodes of this film basically boil down to very politically correct kind of pamphleted explainers rather than organic feeling conflicts and discussions. Mutt is very much a film that I suppose has to be, to a certain extent, aware of itself as a rare example of queer and trans feature cinema that even to its limited, more often educated, more often more privileged art house audiences, even there is basically introducing and conveying these aspects of trans, especially trans male experience for the first time. And again, I'm not even necessarily knocking that as something holding the film back or whatever. I just think overall it does give Mutt this aura of being a primer to all of these different things that Lungalov Klotz can explore, but is kind of deliberately holding at an arm's length as all part of this kind of transient, ephemeral phenomenon that can't really be contained to the story of one person and their anecdotal relationships and experiences. I definitely liked Mutt, though. I give it a fair 3 out of 5, and moving on from that very slight wistful A for art house picture, it was really nice to follow that up with Bottoms, which I was not expecting from its publicity to be actually more than just super bad for gay girls, but in fact a kind of wild, absurd throwback to the kinds of more surreal teen exploitation comedies that distributors like American International Pictures and New World Pictures and Orion used to pick up in the late 70s and then the 80s, which I guess makes it all the more appropriate that Bottoms is in fact being distributed by the reconstituted Orion Pictures. Part of what I ended up liking so much about Bottoms, besides it being very consistently funny, great crowd movie, is that it's one of the most cinematic comedies I've seen in a while. You really see Seligman investing in way more than a lot of contemporary comedy filmmakers in terms of constructing comedy not just from dialogue-based humor, but from all of the possibilities of how you can not only create a humorous scenario, but really use cinematography and editing to pull off a gag or nest little nuggets of smaller jokes within the scene decoration or reveal the setup for a gag that doesn't pay off until much later in the film. And like I said, if you're going into this expecting something like a more vulgar lesbian version of Easy A or Mean Girls, you should know that the sense of humor here really is a lot more out there and sometimes even surreal, almost like a live-action version of Phil Lord and Chris Miller's Clone High. Lord and Miller's influence, as well as Edgar Wright's influence, is all over the place here. But not in a derivative way. Seligman and Sennett really managed to pull off a very unique comedic tone where you're sometimes really not sure what is intended earnestly in terms of some dramatic beats or what's intended ironically in terms of parody of the teen movie genre and in terms of choices of music cues. There's a really great use of Avril Lavigne's Complicated near the end that is kind of a perfect encapsulation of that duality, where on the one hand you kind of suspect that Seligman and co. really are just showing some love to a recently reappraised millennial pop rock standard, but then on the other hand sort of just going with it even though it feels so anachronistic with not just the generation of the characters but also all the other music in the film. Anyway, I really liked Bottoms. My only knock against it would honestly be very similar to my knock against Polite Society from earlier this year, in that for as wonderfully cinematic as both these films are, it's kind of disappointing to see the fight scenes in these movies about girls fighting feeling rather phoned in and not really developed with the same seriousness of comedic investment as other aspects of the film, which all comes to a head in Bottoms with this big climactic brawl that really isn't nearly as cinematically exciting nor as funny as it should be, but still very nice comedy, great crowd comedy, very original. I give this one a 3.5 out of 5. One more real quick one. I'm giving 3 out of 5 to a documentary I saw at the middle of last week, I Got a Monster, which chronicles the crimes committed by, the investigations into, and the prosecution of the notorious gun trace task force of the Baltimore Police Department. This is actually the second of 2 feature films that the editor Kevin Abrams is debuting with this year, the other being a fiction drama called Marisol that is also keenly on my watch list for the year. But with regards to I Got a Monster, I thought this was a very fine documentary, a little overly freewheeling in parts, but still, I think, very comprehensive in terms of exploring its subject. I'm giving this one a modest recommendation. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk about this week's double feature, which actually turned out to be one of the most surprisingly appropriate double features I've had all year, because in spite of how completely different these films are in terms of tone and content, they actually turned out to have very similar thematic arcs, which was especially shocking for me because I more or less decided on only seeing one of these new releases because I actually wanted to see it, and the other tagged on because it was the only one I could practically fit into my afternoon and evening at the nearby Regal. The first film I saw this past Thursday was Camp Hideout, an independently produced family comedy starring Ethan Drew as an orphan teenage delinquent who gets a last chance of avoiding juvenile detention by attending a summer camp. And the second was Outlaw Johnny Black, a blaxploitation-inspired Western comedy starring, co-written, and directed by B action star Michael Jai White, serving as a hotly anticipated spiritual follow-up to his co-writer Byron Mins and Scott Sanders' 2009 masterpiece, Black Dynamite. Now, I'm guessing that all you out there already surmised that Camp Hideout was just sort of the tagged on as a picture to this week's double bill, and I'm not about to sit here and tell you that this is some new revelation in family entertainment, but I will say that, especially following my explanation of my morbid interest in VOD fake movies, the likes put out by distributors like Gravitas Ventures, that maybe you'll join me in an adjacent, though quite different type of investigatory, cinematic, and cultural curiosity that I have, which is with faith-based and Christian cinema. And I want to be clear here that in spite of morbid curiosity being a major part of my interest, that I'm not one of these people who only sees Christian and faith-based movies as a convenient target to bag on for cheap laughs. Indeed, I should probably mention that still, one of my favorite films that I've seen all year is a Christian film, none other than the Erwin brothers' Jesus Revolution, which I thought was an actually quite exceptional historical drama that was very well produced and actually presented a fairly nuanced story that can be appreciated regardless of whether or not you're part of the target audience for Christian films. I think that's a very good recent example of a faith-based film that you can appreciate on its technical merits without having to subscribe to the same charismatic or sometimes proselytizing investment that a more fundamentalist faith-based audience would have with it, which is really not something that you can say about most faith-based films as a prerequisite, and that was certainly not something you could say about virtually any faith-based films even just a few years ago. I actually am very fascinated with the history and the progress of faith-based media over my lifetime, because what not a lot of secular folks seem to have noticed, and I see very few film critics and journalists addressing, is the extent to which faith-based content has really made some major inroads into the mainstream of the commercial film and television industry, to the extent that even a movie like Camp Hideout, a product that is really clearly more intended for the direct-to-video and streaming home theater market, is actually getting a limited theatrical treatment from its distributor, Roadside Attractions, which is a secular indie distributor, but is no stranger to various types of specialty film markets, including faith-based or Christian movies. Now, there have always been certain Christian films that have managed to get limited or even mainstream theatrical distribution, but I think what's notable about a family film like Camp Hideout is that it's the sort of family movie that would have been much more seasonally available at theaters this time of year from major secular production companies and distributors even just a few years ago, but where the conspicuous disincentive by major film companies to theatrically release and give major publicity pushes to middle and low budget family films in favor of big, spectacular tentpoles and animated products has meant that faith-based companies like the producers of Camp Hideout, called Higher Studios, are now moving in to fill a market gap created by this change in incentive structures, and thus giving faith-based and Christian films a much higher profile as not only specialty home video, but as mainstream theatrical products. But what makes Camp Hideout an especially interesting product of this change in the film landscape is that it's a much more granular form of faith-based content that I like to call the stealth Christian film. If you look at the poster for Camp Hideout, even if you watch the trailer, you will notice that there is no indication in the publicity that this is a Christian movie. There is one shot in the trailer, a really brief one, in which the actor Corbin Bleu is framed in front of a wooden cross, but other than that, there's no references to religion, no references to the Bible, no references to God or Jesus, not even any references to faith as a concept or a theme. Camp Hideout is being very cleverly advertised by its secular distributor, Roadside Attractions, as a secular family film, even though it is the flagship production of not only a Christian studio, but a company called Higher Studios, which touts itself as a content creator that funds its overhead and production through the direct investments in and stock purchases of everyday Christian consumers who, they advertise at least, can share in the potential profits of their output. So it's not even just a Christian film, it's a crowd-funded Christian film, which makes it all the more fascinating that the stealth aspect of this faith-based film does not seem to start with Roadside Attractions merely making a cynical cost-benefit decision to advertise the film to as wide of a secular audience as possible. Even if you don't go to see it in theaters, I highly encourage people to watch a movie like Camp Hideout purely from an educational standpoint, because what you will see when you watch it is a Christian film that at first makes no announcement that it is a Christian film, and in fact, for the first 15 or 20 minutes or so, has virtually zero indications, either in dialogue or in costume or in setting, that this film has anything to do with Christian themes at all. But then the troubled protagonist portrayed by Ethan Drew makes it to the summer camp, and as everyone is assembled in the big cabin for their orientation, you realize, oh, there's a big wooden cross on the stage, and there's two banners ever so subtly tacked to the back wall quoting two verses from the Bible, one from the old, one from the new, and you realize, oh, this isn't just a summer camp, this is a Christian summer camp. It's just that, again, nobody is coming out and saying anything about it, even up to the point that nothing that Corbin Bleu's character says in this scene, shown in the trailer, has anything to do with faith-based goals of a Christian institution, which, as somebody who went to Catholic school for 12 years, would be very strange if they never mentioned Jesus or God or faith during the orientation to Christian camp. And then slowly but surely over the course of the narrative, we get more and more stuff. We have a scene where Corbin Bleu is sitting with Ethan Drew by a lake and he takes a Bible out of his satchel, but explicit attention is never drawn to the Bible itself. And in their conversation, Bleu's character asks Drew's character if he wants to pray with him, but he doesn't, and Bleu's character doesn't force it, and he never even mentions the words God or Bible, though he does, without citing the specific text, make an oblique reference to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, and the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, which both contain parables about seeds of knowledge that are scattered and where only those whose soil or souls are receptive to it, it will cultivate and grow into something more. As someone who was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school for the first 12 years of his life, I recognize immediately, like, oh my God, we're doing this. This is how we're going about this. We're just creeping up on us that this isn't just a Christian film. This is a film about Christian conversion. And it really is rather jarring as you slowly start to realize what kind of movie you're watching, where even as explicit as the Christian themes get, even when we're at the point where Ethan Drew's character is literally walking into a church and talking to Blue's character about his own salvation, the dialogue and references to Christianity itself are so deliberately vague that you can only suspect that this isn't just a movie that plays the way it does because it is taking for granted the faith-based orientation of the audience, but that this is, in fact, a movie that is attempting to stealthily draw an unsuspecting secular viewer into identification with it without them ever realizing that they're being proselytized to. And considering the extent to which Christian cinema is making inroads into the commercial mainstream, there is something so fascinatingly obsequious about that aspect of Camp Hideout and what it represents about a certain specialty market within the specialty market of faith-based movies, which is very much interested in presenting itself as secular as possible, including the use of the term faith-based instead of just Christian. The former is a lot more pluralistic connotating. The latter might make you think someone is trying to proselytize to and convert you to a specific religion, and isn't actually terribly interested in various other types of hypothetically faith-based content. You're not going to be seeing any faith-based Islamic or Buddhist cinema at your Main Street multiplex anytime soon. And so what all this works out to is a scenario in which the divestment of the major studios from more run-of-the-mill family content has created these weird avenues for Christian production companies to make these sort of inconspicuous stealth Christian movies that benefit explicitly from catering not only to the fundamentalist Christian market, but also to the vacuum in the secular film market for family-friendly films like this, where there's no cussing, no sexual content, no explicit violence beyond, occasional villains having some slapstick routines, and most importantly, a very firm don't ask, don't tell policy about anything to do with homosexuality or trans people. Because that really is the thing, right? I'm sure we've all noticed that there's no shortage of low-budget family-friendly garbage that goes up on Disney Plus and Netflix and Prime every year, but the difference is that at least nominally speaking, these secular companies are seeing it as being in their best interest to, at the very least, color the backgrounds of their movies and TV shows with more diversity, which includes the acknowledgement of gay people and trans people existing. You'll get the squeaky clean fun you want, you just got to acknowledge that gay and trans people exist. But if you're a faith-based media company catering to a faith-based audience, you already know what the deal is. It's not just the cussing and all this mythical sex and violence that the fundamentalist Christian audience has a problem with. It's the secular part. It's the diversity part. It's the gay kids exist part. And sure, maybe there are some gay kids at Camp Hideout, but you better believe nobody is asking and nobody is telling at Christian summer camp. It turns out Camp Hideout has a kind of a dual meaning to it. And I guess that would incidentally be the other sort of utility of Camp Hideout from a perspective of cultural anthropology, which is just the extent to which that, because it is so stealthy about its faith-based themes, it does kind of ironically accurately portray how nominal and tacked on so much of religious life is to the experience of everyday Christians, even at private faith-based institutions. That was really my experience as someone raised Catholic, which is that a lot of this stuff is just kind of an unquestioned ephemeral backdrop that doesn't really come up all that often except in unique inflection points of crisis and only in drips and drops, not at all unlike the way Ethan Drew's protagonist experiences it. This is not at all dissimilar from how I was educated in Catholic and faith-based institutions. I know this is another case where I'm talking a lot around the movie as opposed to talking about the movie, but I said up front that this was more or less just a tacked-on addition to the double feature, and besides that circumstantial stuff, there's really not a lot to talk about when it comes to Camp Hideout. Even as a family film, it's not particularly good. It's certainly not very funny or very well acted, with the exception of these two actors, Josh Inokala and Joshua Childs, who play these two bumbling, slapstick petty criminals who are out to get Ethan Drew's character. The humorous scenarios they're put into are all very hacky and cliche, but I must say that as actors, I found them perfectly charming, especially Inokala, who, while no one was looking, seems to have decided he was going to play his character like Steve Buscemi in Fargo. I mean, the most positive thing about Camp Hideout is that production-wise, I think it's a very nicely produced and directed movie. The production quality is actually fairly high for a movie of this budget and specialty, and I'm behoved to give credit where credit is due, because of the Jesus freaks are gonna try to sneak this stuff up on us while we're not looking. They could at least try harder and with a greater pedigree than whatever secular junk we'd be vegetating our kids in front of otherwise. So I suppose it's not actually small praise to say that Camp Hideout is a nice looking production. The filmmakers deserve credit on that front. I especially like the very fluid sense of camera work in this. It's a very nice, non-static, non-flat production. Not unlike Slotherhouse in its own specialty market, it is as much like a real movie as it could be. That is, without necessarily being a good movie. But for technical quality and a legitimately fascinating window into the changing dynamics of mainstream faith-based entertainment, I hope you all don't mind if I actually overrate Camp Hideout and actually even recommend it, so that if you yourself are more interested in really investigating Christian and faith-based media, especially of this more stealthy type, this is actually a pretty perfect textbook example. You could practically assign this in a college elective course exactly about this type of movie. For the reward of morbid curiosity and self-educating fascination about the tectonic shifts of culture occurring all around us every day, I'm giving Camp Hideout a charitable 2.5 out of 5. Anyway, with that out of the way, we can get into the real reason we're all here, to talk about Outlaw Johnny Black. And right out of the way, while this is being very much touted and perceived by many fans of Black Dynamite to be a spiritual follow-up to that film, it should be said that Scott Sanders, a co-writer and the director of that film, has not returned for this project, and this really should be seen more as Michael Jai White's official debut as a writer-director, as well as an actor and martial arts star, because whereas White is actually no stranger to writing, directing, or producing films, having previously served as the director and star of 2 direct-to-video Never Back Down sequels, as well as a writer on the latter one, I feel like the Outlaw Johnny Black is really going to surprise a lot of people, because this really isn't at all a retread of Black Dynamite. This is not a self-aware genre parody as much as it is a straightforward Western comedy in which White stars as the titular Johnny Black, an outlaw on a crusade to avenge the death of his father, who ends up masquerading as a preacher in order to evade the law. And when I say that the Outlaw Johnny Black really is more of a straightforward Western comedy, that's because it really is like a real Western. Obviously, rather low budget. There's not a lot about the film that's terribly convincing by conventional standards. But even still, the first most jarring thing about Outlaw Johnny Black, especially if you're going into it expecting a Western riff on Black Dynamite, is that White and his co-writer Byron Mins really have gone to work and buckled down and written and produced a very serious Western story in which a lot of the major narrative material is played completely straight and, more importantly, conveyed very cinematically, with an attention to trying to both be, within its limits, a very slickly produced, stylish film, but one which is actually extraordinarily committed to recreating the feeling of watching a 70s B-Western, especially of the type that actors like Fred Williamson and Jim Brown and Sidney Poitier ended up starring in during the 70s parallel peaks in both black exploitation movies as well as revisionist westerns. I'm thinking especially of films like Buck and the Preacher and Boss N-word, I'm not going to say it, and Take a Hard Ride. From the very outset, there really are long stretches in Outlaw Johnny Black where they're just aren't any jokes or gags, where it really tries to tell a serious Western story. And then when there is humor, while some jokes are more accessible and populist than others, a lot of them are rather offbeat and at first feel rather out of place in terms of White's and Min's attempts to create a serious narrative with serious dramatic beats and moments of genuinely intended romance to it. But over the course of the movie, I must say, what starts as the big surprise about Outlaw Johnny Black and then grows to be the real pleasant surprise of the movie is that, for the most part, it totally and completely works and really achieves an almost indefinably unique tone in which these various moments of innuendo and slapstick and situational comedy start to cohere in an overall legitimate Western parable of vengeance and redemption, and most harrowing of all, a very sincere allegory about this small, mostly black Western town that has to end up defending itself from white aggression once they find out that there's a chance that they're going to be coming into some money and might actually start to thrive and come into their own. Obviously, there are allusions to all sorts of race massacres, including the Tulsa race riot, built into the allegory of this story. I wish I could say only that Outlaw Johnny Black is far from perfect or whatever, but I do have to say that there is a real poisonous flaw to this film, which is just, in spite of how successfully it manages to play with both its offbeat sense of humor and then the more romantic and progressive aspects of its drama, there really are some disgustingly racist aspects to it in terms of its depiction of Indigenous or Native American characters. And I don't just mean insensitivity. I mean to the extent that there are Native American characters in this, and they are literally portrayed in these store-bought stereotypical Halloween costumes and are played by mostly non-Indigenous actors and literally speak in gibberish. It's really offensive stuff on its face, but there's also an even worse nestled in aspect of it, because basically what happens is that Byron Minns, the co-writer who also portrayed Bullhorn in Black Dynamite, he's portraying Reverend Percy, the guy whose identity Johnny Black steals in the movie. And basically what happens is that Percy is kidnapped by some movie Indians and is given by the gibberish-speaking chief to his daughter, who is portrayed by the male actor Regan Mikado. And so the joke obviously being, oh no, I'm going to be forced to marry this fat, ugly Indian girl. So it's just horribly racist and misogynistic on its face. But what makes it worse is specifically the casting of a male actor in this role. It gets into this really uncomfortable territory of like, is this supposed to be some kind of like dog whistle reference to the fact that some indigenous peoples of the Americas had concepts of a third gender, of like biologically male individuals who are allowed to present and dress and identify as women or as neither male nor female? Because that actually happened, and I'm not sure how far I'm willing to pull that thread, because whether it's intentional or not, White and Minns have already written this very racist and misogynistic part into their movie, and it's a big part of the first act of the movie. So I'm not terribly concerned if they've only accidentally also made something that is also homophobic and transphobic, but I'm not prepared to throw out the idea that there's some self-awareness going on here, because there's also a really transphobic scene in Never Back Down, No Surrender, which White also co-wrote in addition to directing and starring in. So it's just sort of continuing a very dispiriting pattern in his action films of this really cavalier mockery of gender nonconformity and queerness. That's honestly the biggest and a major letdown of the movie, and even if it's just part of the willfully tasteless aspect of the film's humor, I'm sorry, but there's really nothing about Outlaw Johnny Black that is in the least bit satiric, and the lack of a satiric intention to its portrayal of indigenous peoples is just kind of underscored, again, by just how enthusiastically sentimental and serious White and Minns are about telling a story with moral weight to it, where it's not just a joke, where there really is a heartfelt film about the redemption and salvation of this outlaw character. And that brings me to what I alluded to before about the really uncanny way in which Camp Hideout turned out to be a perfect double feature with Outlaw Johnny Black, not just in terms of the implicit homophobia and transphobia, because in addition to there being long stretches of this movie in which there are no gags and the dramatic and romantic beats are played totally straight, there is also a very explicit and thorough exploration of Black Christian themes of salvation and forgiveness, up to and including long scenes of dialogue between White and Minz's characters about faith and about Christianity. In its own way, Outlaw Johnny Black really is a conversion story or a born again story, just as much as the squeaky clean stealth Christian family movie Camp Hideout is. I've never really thought of White as being a terribly good actor, and I don't necessarily think his performance in this movie is particularly great either, but to a certain extent, it all just becomes part of a piece of the strange, offbeat sentimentality of this movie, where White really isn't trying to portray Johnny Black as a stereotypical tough guy, but as a character with nuance and sensitivity, and who is often made out to be a fool and is befuddled and not always having everything in hand. If Black Dynamite was in part a parody of the absurd extremes of how Black masculinity is portrayed in Hollywood films, then Outlaw Johnny Black is primarily a serious attempt by White and Minz to move beyond mere parody and to try to articulate a vision of Black manhood that, on the surface, of course, looks like Michael Jai White, but is more than just this dark golem presenting extreme stoicism as something that is deeply spiritual and conflicted, and you can't just pin down by typecasting him because, in White's case, because he's built like a brick house. I was tremendously disappointed by the kind of mind-boggling insensitivity and bigotry of significant parts of Outlaw Johnny Black, but overall, I must say that I was thoroughly engaged by it, entertained by its humor, compelled by its drama and its romance, and I'm ultimately forced to come to the conclusion that this is one of the most exciting, daring, original comedies that I have seen all year. Something that really takes chances that its audience will be invested in it as more than just an opportunity for crude humor and infinite regression into reference to other films. Something that tries to be weird and idiosyncratic and to balance conflicting emotions and give you something you've never seen before. With the caveat that there is a significant compromise to this film because of that severely racist portrayal of indigenous peoples and the nestled homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny of it, I cannot help but recommend Outlaw Johnny Black as a striking unveiling of Michael Jai White as a cinematic artist really coming into his own truly original creative voice. I'm gonna give this one a 4 out of 5. One of the most exciting theater experiences I've had all year. And that is all I've got for you this week. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time.